You're too ugly to be loved." The words echoed through the ballroom loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Conversation stopped. Music seemed to fade. Even the servants froze. Isabella Ashford stood motionless beside the grand staircase, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her blue gown. Across from her stood her father, Lord Ashford, a man whose approval she had spent 22 years trying to earn. Tonight, like every night before it, she had failed. "Father," she whispered. "I'm only telling the truth," he replied coldly. "Look around you. Do you see any gentleman eager to ask for your hand? Do you see anyone crossing this ballroom to dance with you? No. Because men admire beauty, Isabella. And unfortunately, beauty is the one thing God forgot to give you." A few guests looked away in discomfort. Others pretended not to hear. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended her. Nobody ever did. Isabella forced herself to smile despite the sting behind her eyes. Years ago, she would have cried. Years ago, she would have begged him to stop. But experience had taught her a painful lesson. You cannot break a heart that has already learned to expect disappointment. She lowered her gaze. "Of course, Father." Then she turned and walked away before the tears could betray her. She didn't know that someone had heard every word. She didn't know that one of the most powerful men in England had been standing only a few feet away. And she certainly didn't know that before the night was over, that man would change her life forever. But to understand why Duke Alexander Ravenshire crossed a crowded ballroom for a woman everyone else ignored, we must first understand Isabella Ashford. Because long before she became the woman a duke would choose, she was the daughter nobody wanted. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or judged by people who should have loved you, stay with me until the end of this story. And while you're listening, tell me in the comments, do you believe family words can shape a person's confidence for life? Isabella Ashford grew up in a mansion filled with beauty. Unfortunately, none of it belonged to her. Her older sister Victoria was everything society admired: golden hair, perfect posture, delicate features. Men complimented her. Women envied her. Guests spoke about her long after leaving the Ashford estate. Isabella, meanwhile, existed in the background. She wasn't ugly, not truly, but she was ordinary standing beside someone extraordinary. And in a household obsessed with appearances, ordinary might as well have been invisible. Isabella first noticed the difference when she was 8 years old. A famous painter had arrived to create a family portrait. Victoria stood proudly beside their parents while Isabella was instructed to move closer to the edge of the canvas. "We need balance," her father had explained. Years later, she would realize what he truly meant. Victoria was the picture. Isabella was the frame. Small moments like that happened constantly. At dinner, guests praised Victoria's beauty while forgetting Isabella's name. During holidays, expensive gifts arrived for Victoria while Isabella received practical items chosen by servants. Even their mother seemed resigned to the imbalance. Not cruel, just absent. As though she had quietly accepted that one daughter mattered more than the other. The older Isabella became, the harder it grew to ignore. By 16, Victoria already had admirers arriving weekly. Flowers, letters, invitations. Isabella received none. She told herself it didn't matter. She focused on books instead. She spent afternoons reading in the library. She learned history, poetry, languages. She discovered worlds larger than the one she lived in. Yet every so often reality reminded her who she was. One afternoon she overheard two visiting women speaking in the garden. "Victoria will marry a duke one day." Without question. Then came laughter. "And what about the other daughter? Which one?" Isabella stood frozen behind a hedge. The women genuinely couldn't remember her name. That night she cried quietly beneath her blankets where nobody could hear. Eventually she stopped expecting approval, stopped expecting attention, stopped expecting love. It hurt less that way. At least that was what she told herself. Then came the winter ball, the grandest social event of the year. Nobles traveled from across the country to attend. Every eligible bachelor would be there. Every influential, family, every ambitious mother hoping to arrange a match. Isabella didn't want to go, but attendance was mandatory. For weeks, servants prepared gowns. Victoria selected jewelry. Invitations arrived daily. Excitement filled the estate. Isabella felt only dread. The evening began exactly as expected. Victoria looked breathtaking. Guests surrounded her instantly. Compliments followed wherever she went. Isabella lingered near the edges of the ballroom, hoping to avoid attention. Unfortunately, her father found her anyway, and that led to the humiliation everyone would remember. After escaping the ballroom, Isabella hurried onto a secluded terrace overlooking the snow-covered gardens. The cold air struck her face immediately. She welcomed it. It felt honest, unlike people. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She hated herself for crying. After all these years, she should have been stronger. Yet somehow hearing those words spoken publicly had reopened wounds she thought had healed. "You're too ugly to be loved." The sentence repeated itself inside her mind. Maybe he was right. Maybe everyone else had simply been too polite to say it aloud. Maybe she truly was destined to spend her life alone. A movement nearby interrupted her thoughts. Isabella quickly wiped her eyes. A man stood several feet away beneath the moonlight, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black formal attire. For a moment neither spoke. Then he stepped forward. "Forgive me," he said softly. "I didn't mean to intrude." Isabella recognized him immediately. Her heart nearly stopped. Duke Alexander Ravenshire, one of the most sought-after men in England. Wealthy, respected, intelligent. The man countless women dreamed of marrying, and he was standing alone with her. "Your Grace," she said nervously. Alexander offered a small smile. "You don't have to look frightened. I promise I don't bite." To her surprise, Isabella laughed. It was a brief sound, but it was genuine. Alexander seemed pleased by it. "There it is," he said. "I've been wondering what your smile looked like." Isabella blinked. "You know who I am?" "Of course I do." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Alexander's expression softened. "Because some people are impossible to forget." Isabella stared at him in confusion. Nobody had ever described her that way before? Nobody. Then Alexander glanced toward the ballroom doors, his jaw tightened. "I also heard what your father said." Instantly the warmth vanished from Isabella's face. Embarrassment flooded back. Of course he had heard. Of course. She looked away. "Then I'd rather not discuss it." Alexander remained silent for several seconds. Finally he said, "Good." Isabella frowned. "Good?" "Because I have no interest in discussing a lie." She looked back at him. Alexander held her gaze steadily. "Your father was wrong, Isabella." For the first time in 22 years, someone had finally said the words she never imagined hearing. And for reasons she couldn't explain, hearing them from Alexander Ravenshire felt different than hearing them from anyone else. Isabella didn't know how to respond. For a woman who had spent her life preparing for cruelty, kindness felt almost suspicious. She wrapped her arms around herself and looked toward the snowy garden. "You shouldn't say such things, Your Grace." Alexander tilted his head. "Why not?" "Because people may misunderstand." "Let them." She turned back to him, startled by the calmness in his voice. Most noblemen cared deeply about reputation. They guarded every glance, every word, every rumor. Yet Alexander stood before her as if the opinion of the entire ballroom meant nothing. "You don't know me," Isabella said quietly. "Not truly. Alexander looked at her for a long moment. I know more than you think. Before she could ask what he meant, the ballroom doors opened. Laughter spilled onto the terrace, followed by Victoria and two young gentlemen. Victoria stopped when she saw them. Her smile faded for just a second before returning brighter than before. Isabella, she said sweetly. There you are. Father was wondering where you ran off to. Her eyes shifted to Alexander. Your Grace, what a pleasant surprise. The men beside Victoria immediately bowed. Victoria moved closer, arranging her expression into the charming softness she used whenever powerful men were present. I don't believe we've been properly introduced tonight. Alexander bowed politely, but his attention did not linger on her. Lady, Victoria. Victoria's smile tightened slightly. She was used to men staring, used to them losing their thoughts when she spoke, but Alexander simply looked back at Isabella. I was speaking with Lady Isabella? The words were simple, yet they landed like a thunderclap. Victoria glanced at her sister as though seeing her for the first time. With Isabella? One of the gentlemen coughed awkwardly. Isabella wanted the ground to open beneath her. I should return inside, she said quickly, but Alexander extended his hand. Then allow me to escort you. She stared at his hand as if it were a dangerous thing. No man had ever offered his arm to her in public, not sincerely, not with people watching. Victoria's eyes sharpened. Isabella knew what everyone would think. They would think she had somehow tricked him. They would whisper. They would laugh. Worse, her father would be furious. Your Grace, that isn't necessary. I know, Alexander said softly. I'm not offering because it is necessary. Something in his voice made refusal impossible. Slowly, Isabella placed her hand on his arm. The walk back into the ballroom felt longer than any journey she had ever taken. Conversations dimmed as they entered. Heads turned, fans lifted, eyes followed. Isabella felt every stare like heat against her skin. She kept her gaze lowered, but Alexander walked as though nothing unusual had happened, as though escorting her before the entire room was the most natural thing in the world. Lord Ashford saw them first. His face changed immediately. Shock, confusion, then anger carefully hidden behind manners. Victoria followed behind them, her smile now brittle. Alexander led Isabella to the center of the ballroom just as the musicians began a new waltz. Then he stopped and faced her. May I have this dance? Isabella forgot how to breathe. Around them, the room fell silent again. Only this time the silence wasn't filled with pity. It was filled with disbelief. Your Grace, she whispered, people are watching. Good, he replied. Then they will see clearly. Her fingers trembled as he took her hand. The first steps were uncertain. Isabella hadn't danced in months. There had been no reason to practice. No gentleman ever asked. But Alexander guided her gently, never rushing, never making her feel foolish. Look at me, he said. She hesitated. I can't. Yes, you can. Slowly she lifted her eyes. Alexander smiled. Not with pity, not with amusement, with admiration. Real admiration. Something inside Isabella cracked. Not brokenness this time, something older, something trapped, a belief she had buried beneath years of shame. Perhaps she was not invisible after all. As they moved across the floor, whispers spread like fire. Why her? Did the Duke lose a wager? Poor Victoria. Lord Ashford must be pleased. Pleased was not the word for Lord Ashford. He stood near the staircase with a face carved from stone. Isabella could feel his anger from across the room, but for the first time in her life, his anger was not the loudest thing inside her. Alexander's hand at her back was steady. His eyes remained on hers. You dance beautifully, he said. Isabella nearly laughed. Now I know you are lying. I rarely lie. Then you are being generous. No, he said. I am being observant. She lowered her eyes again, overwhelmed. Alexander's voice softened. Who taught you to dismiss every good thing said about you? The question struck deeper than expected. Isabella said nothing. She didn't need to. Alexander understood. When the dance ended, the applause was hesitant at first, then polite. Alexander bowed. Isabella curtsied. Before she could retreat, he spoke clearly enough for nearby guests to hear. Thank you, Lady Isabella. That was the finest dance I've had all evening. The room shifted. A sentence like that from Duke Ravenshire was not casual. It was a declaration. Victoria's face paled. Lord Ashford moved toward them immediately. Your Grace? He said with forced warmth. What an honor. I hope my daughter has not inconvenienced you? Isabella flinched at the subtle insult. Alexander noticed. On the contrary, he said. She improved my evening considerably. Lord Ashford's smile froze. You are kind. No, Alexander replied. I am honest. Isabella's heart pounded. She could not remember anyone speaking to her father that way, especially not on her behalf. Lord Ashford looked from Alexander to Isabella. My daughter is shy. She is not accustomed to such attention, perhaps because she has been denied it unfairly. The words were quiet but sharp. Victoria quickly stepped forward. Father only means Isabella has always preferred the background. Alexander looked at her then, truly looked. Has she preferred it, or was she placed there? Victoria had no answer. Neither did Lord Ashford. Isabella felt exposed, frightened, and strangely protected all at once. Your Grace, she said softly, trying to stop the tension. Please. Alexander heard the plea and immediately eased. He would not turn her pain into a spectacle. Not tonight. Forgive me, he said. I meant no discomfort. Lord Ashford recovered quickly. Perhaps we should all enjoy the evening. But his eyes warned Isabella that this was far from over. The rest of the ball became unbearable. People who had ignored her for years suddenly wanted introductions. Women studied her gown. Men bowed with sudden interest. Some were curious, some jealous, some cruel. But all of them were watching. Isabella wanted to disappear. Alexander, however, stayed nearby. Never too close to create scandal. Never too far to leave her alone. When a young lord asked Victoria to dance and glanced at Isabella with confusion, Victoria laughed too loudly. When an older woman complimented Isabella's unexpected charm, Alexander's expression darkened. When Lord Ashford tried twice to pull Isabella away, Alexander calmly interrupted both times. By midnight, the story had already spread. Duke Ravenshire had chosen the ignored Ashford daughter over the beautiful one. To society, it was gossip. To Victoria, it was humiliation. To Lord Ashford, it was a threat. But to Isabella, it was terrifying hope. Later, as guests gathered for supper, Alexander found her near the library doors. Are you hiding again? He asked gently. Isabella gave a tired smile. I am resting. From dancing? From being seen. Alexander's face softened. Is it so terrible? She looked toward the crowded hall. When you have spent your life being invisible, being seen feels almost violent. He absorbed that quietly. Then he said, I understand that more than you know. Isabella looked at him with surprise. You? Everyone sees you. They see my title, my fortune, my estate, my reputation. His smile faded. Very few see me. For the first time, Isabella wondered what loneliness looked like when dressed in power. Alexander leaned against the wall beside her, keeping a respectful distance. May I tell you something? She nodded. Tonight was not the first time I noticed you. Isabella frowned. What do you mean? 3 years ago, at Lady Pembroke's charity luncheon, a servant dropped a tray of tea. Everyone laughed. You were the only person who helped her, Isabella remembered vaguely. Anyone would have helped. No, Alexander said. They didn't. She looked down. That is not remarkable. Kindness is always remarkable when it costs comfort. Isabella had no response. Alexander continued. Last spring at church, an elderly widow sat alone because no one wanted to be delayed by her stories. You sat with her for nearly an hour. Isabella's breath caught. You saw that? Yes. Why were you watching me? The question came softly. Alexander's answer came even softer. Because the room was full of beautiful people trying to be admired. You were the only one not performing. Isabella felt tears rise again, but this time they came from a different place. I thought nobody noticed. I did. 2 words. Simple. Impossible. Healing. Before she could speak, Lord Ashford appeared at the end of the corridor. His expression was controlled, but his eyes were cold. Isabella. A word. Her body reacted before her mind did. Shoulders tightening, chin lowering, breath shortening. Alexander noticed everything. Lord Ashford, he said calmly, I was speaking with your daughter, and now I am speaking with mine. The possessiveness in his voice made Isabella shrink. Alexander's gaze hardened. Then speak with respect. Silence dropped between them. Lord Ashford looked stunned. No one corrected him, not servants, not family, not guests, certainly not his daughters, but Alexander Ravenshire had done it without raising his voice. Isabella whispered, Your Grace, please. Lord Ashford forced a laugh. You misunderstand. Isabella is sensitive. She exaggerates. Alexander looked at Isabella. She wanted to deny it, to protect her father, to protect the family name, to do what she had always done. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the dance. Maybe it was the way Alexander had remembered her kindness. Maybe it was the strange new feeling that perhaps she did not deserve every wound given to her. So she said nothing, and her silence spoke loudly. Lord Ashford's smile disappeared. Come with me, Isabella. Alexander stepped slightly forward. Only if she wishes to. Isabella's heart pounded so hard she could hear it. Her father stared at her. Victoria stood behind him now, watching with sharp humiliation. Guests lingered nearby, pretending not to listen. The old Isabella would have obeyed instantly. The old Isabella would have apologized for being noticed, but tonight, for the first time, she looked at her father and said, I would like to stay. Lord Ashford's face darkened. Victoria gasped softly. Alexander did not smile, but pride flickered in his eyes. Lord Ashford leaned closer, lowering his voice. Do not mistake a duke's curiosity for affection. Isabella's courage trembled, but before it could collapse, Alexander spoke. I assure you, Lord Ashford, my intentions are not curiosity. The corridor went still. Lord Ashford turned slowly. And what exactly are your intentions? Alexander looked at Isabella first, as if asking permission without words. She could barely breathe. Then he faced her father. With your permission, I would like to call on Lady Isabella. A collective whisper moved through the hall. Victoria's face drained of color. Lord Ashford looked as though he had been struck. Call on Isabella? Yes. Surely you mean Victoria. The cruelty of it was automatic, effortless. Isabella felt it like a familiar blade. Alexander's jaw tightened. I know exactly whom I mean. For one stunning moment nobody moved. Then Lord Ashford laughed. Not kindly, not warmly. A sharp, ugly laugh that made Isabella's stomach twist. Your Grace, forgive me, but you cannot be serious. Alexander's eyes became cold. I am rarely more serious. Lord Ashford looked at Isabella with open disgust, forgetting the watching guests. This is absurd. Isabella stepped back. The hope inside her began to fracture. Of course it would end this way. Her father would ruin it. He always did. Alexander remained calm. Is that a refusal? Lord Ashford lifted his chin. It is. My daughter is not suited to be courted by a man of your rank. The words fell heavily, but Alexander did not retreat. Instead, he looked at Isabella with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not pity, not anger. Devotion beginning before either of them dared name it. Then he turned back to Lord Ashford and said, Then tomorrow I will ask again. The following morning, Lord Ashford convinced himself the previous evening had been a misunderstanding. Surely the Duke would come to his senses. Surely a man like Alexander Ravenshire would realize he had been distracted by sympathy and return his attention to Victoria. After all, that was how the world worked. Beautiful women were chosen. Ordinary women were forgotten. It was a rule Lord Ashford had believed for so long that he mistook it for truth. Unfortunately for him, Alexander Ravenshire had no intention of following his rules. At precisely 11 o'clock, a carriage bearing the Ravenshire crest arrived at the Ashford estate. Servants rushed to open the gates. Word spread through the house instantly. Victoria nearly dropped her teacup. Isabella's heart stopped. Lord Ashford looked genuinely irritated. Alexander entered the drawing room with calm confidence. He greeted everyone politely before turning toward Isabella. And for the first time in her life, Isabella experienced something completely unfamiliar. She was the first person someone important looked for when entering a room. Lady Isabella, Alexander said warmly, I hope you slept well. She smiled nervously. I tried. I failed entirely. A small laugh escaped her. Lord Ashford did not find it amusing. Your Grace, he interrupted, I believe I made my position clear last night. Alexander nodded. You did? Then why are you here? Because I respectfully disagree with it. The room fell silent. Victoria stared at the floor. Their mother looked overwhelmed. Isabella could barely breathe. Lord Ashford folded his arms. This fascination with Isabella will pass. Alexander's expression never changed. What makes you think it is fascination? Because no sensible man would seriously pursue her. Isabella felt the words strike like a slap. Even after everything, her father could not stop. Alexander slowly turned toward him. Tell me something, Lord Ashford. What? When was the last time you said something kind to your daughter? Lord Ashford blinked. For perhaps the first time in years, he genuinely had no answer. Alexander continued. When was the last time you praised her? Silence. When was the last time you made her feel valued? Isabella looked away. Her chest tightened painfully. She didn't want this conversation. She didn't want her wounds displayed before everyone. But Alexander wasn't trying to embarrass her father. He was exposing a truth nobody had been brave enough to acknowledge. Lord Ashford finally scoffed. You know nothing about my family. Alexander's gaze sharpened. I know enough. Then he stood and looked directly at Isabella. Would you care to accompany me for a walk? Lord Ashford immediately objected. Absolutely not. But before Alexander could respond, something remarkable happened. Isabella spoke first. I would like to go. Everyone turned toward her, including herself. She had spent 22 years avoiding conflict, apologizing, shrinking, obeying. Yet the words had emerged without permission. Lord Ashford stared at her in disbelief. What did you say? Isabella swallowed hard. Fear twisted inside her stomach. But another feeling existed beside it now. Strength. Small, fragile, new. I said I would like to go. For a moment nobody moved. Then Alexander offered his arm. This time Isabella took it without hesitation. They spent hours walking through the village beyond the estate. For the first time, Isabella wasn't being compared to Victoria. She wasn't being evaluated. She wasn't being ignored. Alexander simply listened. She told him about the books she loved, the places she dreamed of visiting, the fears she rarely admitted aloud. Alexander shared stories of his own loneliness, the expectations that came with power, the difficulty of knowing whether people loved him or his title. By the end of the afternoon, something undeniable existed between them, not attraction alone, understanding, connection, recognition, the feeling of finally being seen. Over the following weeks, Alexander visited often. Predictably, society exploded with gossip. Some people claimed he was mad. Others insisted it was a temporary amusement. Many believed he would eventually choose Victoria instead. But Alexander ignored every rumor. He continued showing up, continued seeking Isabella's company, continued proving that his attention was not a mistake. And something unexpected began happening. Isabella changed, not because Alexander transformed her, because he helped her see what had always been there. She laughed more, spoke more confidently, held eye contact, shared opinions, smiled without apology. The more she healed, the more obvious it became that her father's judgment had never been truth. It had simply been cruelty repeated so often that everyone accepted it as fact, including Isabella herself. Then came the day everything finally broke. The Ashfords hosted a spring luncheon attended by much of the county. Nobles gathered beneath white tents in the garden. Musicians played softly. Servants carried silver trays. Isabella stood beside Alexander greeting guests when she overheard a familiar voice. Her father. "The Duke is blinded by pity," Lord Ashford was saying to another gentleman. "Eventually, he'll realize his mistake." Isabella froze. The words hurt, not because they were new, because they were old, because even now, after everything, her father still refused to see her. Alexander heard them too. Slowly he turned. The conversation around them faded. Guests sensed something changing. Lord Ashford noticed their approach and straightened immediately. "Your Grace." Alexander stopped a few feet away. His voice remained calm. "You believe I pity Isabella?" Lord Ashford shifted uncomfortably. "I merely think your judgment is clouded." Alexander nodded slowly. Then he did something nobody expected. He addressed the entire gathering. "May I ask everyone here a question?" Silence spread across the garden. "How many of you have been told who you are by someone else?" Faces turned toward him. "How many of you spent years believing something about yourself because another person repeated it often enough?" Nobody spoke, but many lowered their eyes. Alexander continued. "For years, Isabella was told she wasn't beautiful enough, valuable enough, worthy enough." His voice grew firmer, and eventually she believed it. Isabella felt tears forming. "But let me tell you what I see." Every eye moved toward her. "I see kindness that expects nothing in return. I see intelligence that never seeks attention. I see courage that survived years of criticism without becoming bitterness." He stepped closer to Isabella. "I see a woman whose character is more beautiful than anything time could ever steal." Complete silence followed. Several women wiped tears from their eyes. Even some men looked uncomfortable, because deep down, everyone recognized the truth. Lord Ashford's face had gone pale. Alexander looked directly at him. "The tragedy is not that Isabella believed she wasn't enough." His voice softened. "The tragedy is that her own father taught her to believe it." The word struck harder than any insult. For the first time, Lord Ashford looked shaken, truly shaken, not angry, not defensive, wounded, because somewhere deep inside, he realized Alexander was right. Memories flashed through his mind. Family portraits, harsh comments, dismissive glances, forgotten birthdays, years of small cruelties he had never considered significant. Suddenly he saw them through Isabella's eyes, and the realization was devastating. Isabella looked at her father, the man who had shaped her childhood, the man whose approval she had chased for decades, the man whose words still haunted her. She expected anger. Instead, she felt sadness. Lord Ashford opened his mouth, closed it, then quietly said, "Isabella." Her name sounded different somehow, softer, human. "I never intended." He stopped. Tears filled his eyes. "I never realized." Isabella's heart ached, because that was the worst part. He wasn't lying. He truly hadn't realized. The damage had been done so casually that he hadn't even noticed. "I know," she whispered. Lord Ashford looked as though she had forgiven him. She hadn't, not completely. Forgiveness takes time. Healing takes time. But for the first time, she no longer needed his approval to feel worthy. And that changed everything. Alexander reached into his coat pocket. Gasps spread through the crowd as he lowered himself onto one knee. Isabella's breath caught. The world seemed to stop. Alexander looked up at her with complete certainty. Lady Isabella Ashford. Tears blurred her vision. "You once believed nobody could love you." His voice trembled slightly. "I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that was never true." Several guests openly cried. Victoria covered her mouth. Even Lord Ashford looked overwhelmed. Alexander opened a small velvet box. "Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Isabella laughed through tears. 22 years of pain, 22 years of doubt, 22 years of believing she was unworthy. All of it led to this moment. "Yes," she whispered. Alexander smiled. "I didn't quite hear that." Laughter spread through the crowd. Isabella wiped her eyes. Then she answered louder, stronger. "Yes." Applause erupted throughout the garden. Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger and stood. The future stretched before them. Not perfect, not painless, but hopeful. Real. Earned. Months later, as Isabella walked down the aisle toward the man who had taught her how to see herself differently, she noticed her father crying in the front row. For once, she did not look away. She simply smiled. Because the little girl who once hid at the edge of family portraits was gone. In her place stood a woman who finally understood something powerful. Worth is not determined by the people who fail to see it, and love does not begin when someone chooses you. Love begins when you finally realize you were worthy all along. If Isabella's journey touched your heart, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And remember this: never